A very good evening to our respected Professor in charge, Professor Dr. Sarabjit Kaur, our resource persons, Dr. Alok Sharma, Dr. Preeti Rana, and Mr. Amit, and our enthusiastic students and my worthy colleagues. I, Shivika Chaudhary, Assistant Professor at Law Center 1 Faculty of Law, University of Delhi, and in my capacity as the Program Director, I welcome you all to the webinar on subject orientation for overview of optional subjects for LLB third term. It is a kind request to all the students to please log in from due email for technical compliance. Further, to ensure noise-free dissemination of the webinar, the participants are requested to kindly mute the microphones while the presenter is speaking. Students, please post your questions in the chat box anytime during the session to be addressed by the presenter. The recorded version of this webinar will be made available on the LC1 YouTube channel. At this stage, when you're about to enter your third term, you will be baffled with what subject option to choose. And so to answer to all these conundrums, the Law Center 1 has organized today's webinar. I feel honored to welcome you all. Post the webinar very important, and its reiteration that will keep happening throughout the whole webinar is that the subject option forms will be made available on the same poster that was circulated for the webinar. The link will be activated at 7 p.m. today evening, and it will be available till 5 p.m. on Monday of August 16. So please fill in your options. You need to choose one option out of 3 optional subjects that are available. So with this hearty welcome to you all, now I invite Dr. Anju Sinha, the program director for this event, to please present the welcome address.
Thank you, Shivika. A very good evening to learned colleagues, resource persons, and my dear students. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all in this webinar on the subject orientation for overview of optional subjects. This webinar is organized under the guidance of Professor in charge, Law Center 1, Professor Dr. Sarabjit Kaur, for facilitating students to understand relevance and scope of various optional subjects in third semester. In third semester, there are 4 compulsory subjects and 1 optional subject is to be chosen by you from the given subjects. Now, many times, students have problem in selecting subjects, or even if they have selected optional subjects, they want to change it because when they start attending classes on a particular subject, they realize that subject is not that relevant, or subject is not relevant in a way it is not helping them in their future plans. So for guiding you, we have a panel of experts as resource persons who will explain the subjects and help you to take a reasoned decision regarding the selection of optional subjects. And I'm sure that you all are going to be benefited by the information which the resource persons are going to share. So today we have Dr. Alok Sharma to give insight about white-collar crime, Dr. Preeti Rana to explain the scope of private international law, and Dr. Amit Sinha for sharing his views on media and law. But before handing over the platform to the resource persons, I would like to make few announcements. Number 1, as informed by Shivika, subject option form will be available from 7 p.m. today itself. So you need to fill that option form within the deadline, that is before Monday. But please don't fill option form in a hurry. Think twice and take a reasoned decision on the basis of information given by resource persons. Secondly, even after the webinar, if you are having any doubts or query, first of all, you can contact during the webinar, you can contact the resource persons and you can clear your doubts. But even after webinar, if you are having any doubt or query, you can contact resource persons for clarification of your doubts. And one more thing, once your option form is filled, it's final. After that, you will not be allowed to change your option. And also, please inform your friends who could not attend today's webinar due to any reasons that this program will be uploaded on the official YouTube channel of Law Center 1. Now, without taking much of your time, I now invite Dr. Preeti Rana to give insight of private international law. Over to you, ma'am. You are not audible, ma'am.
Am I audible now?
Yes, 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 very much.
A very good evening to the respected faculty members. Today I'm here to give you a brief overview of the one of your optional subjects being private international law. So I would try my best to help you out in this. And if you further have any queries, you can contact me or you can just ask over this platform right over here. So when we do talk about private international law, this particular branch of law comes into picture whenever in our legal transactions there is some foreign element present. So, and by this foreign element, we mean that it can be in any form wherein, let's say, the parties are of different citizens or the parties are having different domiciles, or where certain scenarios where the contract was entered into, let's say, contract was entered into India and it was to be performed in some other foreign jurisdiction. So again, we have a foreign element here, or the tort has been committed outside India. So a whole lot of affairs, especially in today's scenario where there is so much regular transnational movement of individuals. So the scope and sphere of private international law is really wide. You talk it and you have it in any number of transaction, be it contract, be it torts, be it matrimonial affairs, be it in arbitration field. So whenever in any legal transaction or whenever in any suit, a foreign element is present, maybe in the form where the parties are of different nationalities or they have different domiciles. So the question before the particular court comes is that whether they have jurisdiction to look into that proceeding, first of all. And if they do have the jurisdiction, then the next question comes is that which particular law are they going to apply in that jurisdiction? And once they are settled with that, then another issue which is they have to thought over here is about that whether there has been a foreign judgment on that particular issue and whether that foreign judgment can be recognized and enforced in that forum. So these are the three main questions which any suit in a private international law, the judiciary is concerned with. Firstly, that whether they have the jurisdiction, which type of or which choice of law is going to be applied here, and whether there has been a decree in that matter, and whether that decree or whether that judgment can be recognized or enforced in the forum. Now, when we talk about these, it does sound very simple and easy, but actually it's not. Let me give you an example. Let's say an Indian woman who was, let's say, who happens to be a 16-year-old enters into marriage with a French national in Spain. Now here we have three different nationalities involved, or three different jurisdiction laws are involved here. One, the woman is Indian citizen, then we have a foreign French national, and the marriage was solemnized in Spain. So if a question of validity of this marriage comes before the Indian courts, because the girl, when she got married, she was 16 years of age. So if the Indian court applies Indian laws, then the marriage becomes unlawful because the girl has not attained the age of 18 years. But we may find that the Spanish laws, where the marriage was solemnized, therein the age of entering into marriage is permissible if the female has attained the age of 16. So now we get a conflict here, we do get a clash here, and also we do have to look into the French laws, because one of the party of marriage is a French national here. So this is how a foreign element comes into picture, and that's how we do get conflict of laws. And also the another nomenclature or another name for private international law is conflict of laws, because people of different domiciles or people of different nationalities are involved. That is why we do get to see conflicts. And the very first question before the court before whom the suit has been filed, the court has to see that whether they have the jurisdiction to entertain that suit or not, and also which law are they going to apply here. So here in this particular example which I shared with you, if the Indian court straight away they goes on to apply the Indian law, then the marriage becomes unlawful. And if they apply the French law, then the marriage may be valid depending upon how the scenario therein is. So in order to solve this conflict of laws, which we do get to see on regular basis, wherein we have whatever be it the matrimonial affairs or the contractual issues or the torts. So we have certain prescribed principles therein, wherein the states or nations out of comity, wherein they have entered into some mutual agreements. There are bilateral agreements, there are agreements between the nations to solve such scenarios, and wherein that is why we come to the scenario wherein the private international law, the conflict of laws, comes to the rescue of the judiciary herein. And in order to solve such issues, the judiciary goes on to apply the principles of private international law, because therein we have various conventions, like Hague Convention plays a major role in private international law, wherein we have so many conventions, be it the child custody issues, be it the inter-country adoption, be it the recognition and celebration of validity of marriages, be it the ex parte divorce decree, if it has been obtained by one of the party, then how it is going to be enforced. So in all these scenarios, we have the principles of private international law. Another example you can see is that wherein two different nationals enters into a contract in India, wherein the contract is to be performed in the foreign jurisdiction. So now if there is some breach, which particular law is going to be applied and which particular court is going to have the jurisdiction? So again, we come to these three basic questions, which any matter involving a foreign element, when we talk about private international law, has to be decided first before proceeding further, that whether that particular court has jurisdiction and what choice of law is going to be applied therein, and the recognition and enforcement of foreign decree. Because many a times in matrimonial affairs, you must have heard or read about this also, because this is very common. That is why I'm picking up this example, wherein we have the issues of NRI marriages, wherein the NRIs do come to India, they get married to Indian women, and they go back to the places of their domicile. So it's not just the different nationalities has to be there to be the matter under private international law. If the parties are of different domicile, then also private international law comes into picture. So here, if the person has come from US and he has the domicile of United States, and he has entered into a marriage between with an Indian woman here in India only, and after marriage the parties move back to US, and now if that person obtains, let's say the wife has not joined him, she's about to join him, she's still in India, and many times it is the common issue in such alliances, wherein the person who's staying at US, that male, he obtains an ex parte divorce decree against the woman, and she has not visited him even once, and she's served with a divorce decree right here sitting in India, and wherein she didn't get even a chance to represent herself therein before the US courts. So now the question comes is that first of all, whether this issue can be taken up by Indian courts, because if she has taken a recourse under Indian courts challenging this divorce decree, first of all, can Indian courts take a jurisdiction here? And if they do have jurisdiction over that issue, which law are they going to apply? And before applying any law, the major question comes up here is that ex parte divorce decree which has been obtained by that husband in US, whether that the ex parte divorce decree is or can be recognized and enforced in India. And for this, we have Section 13 of Civil Procedure Code here, which lays down all the do's and don'ts, which provides that if an ex parte divorce decree has been obtained, whether in what scenarios it is going. I'm not going into that much detail here. So therein we have all the possibilities and all the scenarios laid down under section 13 of CPC, that under what scenario ex parte divorce decree would be recognized and enforced in India, or if some fraud has been played, or and all those scenarios. When you read it in detail, you'll find it. So all this thing, so many a times if you get to see that a tort has been committed in foreign jurisdiction, and now the matter comes up. So again, we are stuck with the same situation, that the jurisdiction and choice of law. So the entire private international law revolves upon these three. We can say that these three questions form the basic main pillar of private international law: the question of, or the choice of jurisdiction, then choice of law, which law is going to be applicable here, and the recognition and enforcement of foreign decree award. And if you get to see the syllabus laid down for you in this private international law, all these scenarios, all sort of these issues are laid down there, and that's what you're going to study if you opt for this subject. There we have one of the unit deals with the contractual aspects. Another unit talks about the issues of torts involved, wherein a foreign element is involved. Then we have another unit for matrimonial affairs. We have the issue of recognition and enforcement of foreign decree. And having said this, so one thing you must be clear with, that when we talk about public international law, therein we talk about the entities and state. When a matter is between the state, the public international law comes into picture. But when we talk about private international law, it is between the individuals. When two different individuals are having different domicile or having different nationality, they have some legal transaction involved in which is to be decided, then private international law comes into picture. So that is the difference between public and private international law. And also, if you many a times one school of thought comes for this counter argument, that having if any particular municipal code is applying a foreign law, being the rules of conflict of laws, in order to decide a particular issue which has come before it, then it is succumbing its sovereignty or its jurisdiction to the foreign law. It is not that. This is done because of the Comity of Nations, or this is done because the ultimate aim of private international law is that no injustice is done to the parties, because many a times applying just one particular law without applying the principles of conflict of laws, that might result into injustice to that party. And in order to avoid that injustice, that is why we have these principles of private international law, in order to do complete justice to the parties involved therein, keeping in mind the different domiciles or different nationalities or any type of foreign element, depending upon the circumstances and scenarios of that case. And also many a times, because the parties are also well aware of this fact, that we do have different municipal laws. Because in India we have different sets of municipal laws for matrimonial affairs, different municipal laws for torts or contracts, and so on and so on. And in some other foreign jurisdictions, they have altogether different municipal laws for these various fields. So they are very much aware that if they take recourse under the another foreign jurisdiction, that the decision might be favorable to them. So, and that is what we call forum shopping. So in order to avoid this forum shopping on the part of the parties to get the decrees in their favor, that is why again we have these rules of conflict of laws, or rules of private international law, to do justice to both the parties, because it is very important, and that is the very much aim or ultimate object of private international law, because no injustice should be done to either of the parties involved in the proceedings or the suits therein. So I guess that is it from my side. This is all the private international law is all about. So if you have any question, you can just ask me, if you, anyone. So you just have to remember that private international law is just about that whenever a foreign element is therein, the courts have to see that what particular law is going to be applicable therein. And when we talk about foreign element, that can be in any way, being the parties of different nationalities, or the contract has been entered into some foreign jurisdiction and it is to be performed in some other third foreign jurisdiction, or torts. So the applicability of private international law is in majorly all the spheres. Be it contracts, be it matrimonial affairs, be it torts, or be you talk about any other sphere. And that is why we have, and this particular private international law, this sphere is largely, when we talk about sources or the of this law, we do have precedents, and we do have a large number of conventions here. And as I just told you, that Hague conventions play a major role therein. So that these conventions and precedents come for the aid of the judiciary whenever they are stuck with such situations of wherein rules of conflict of laws are to be applied therein. So any question, anyone?
Dr. Preeti, there is one question for you in the chat box.
Okay. Okay. Both the questions are regarding the applicability of this subject in the judiciary, from the judiciary exams point of view. So, as far as my knowledge is concerned, I might be wrong because I'm not sure on this. I might take help of other faculty members if they are aware of it. But ma'am, Anju ma'am, as far as my knowledge is concerned, this subject is not there in the judiciary exams, is it?
I think it's not there in judiciary, but it's there in UPSC.
Okay, so as ma'am the UPSC aspect, but judiciary, yes, it's not there, but it's there in UPSC. So you can take a call on that. But anyone going for litigation or going for further research, call which I want to opt.
So thank you so much, Dr. Preeti, for giving insight about this particular subject, and I'm sure the students are going to be benefited by the explanation which has been given, the scope which you told them about international law. And international law, according to you, is for the purpose of is there for the purpose of doing justice and for the purpose of avoiding injustice. That is the main object of international law. So I hope the students, they are definitely going to be benefited by the presentation made by you. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Okay, ma'am, just one question coming.
Yes, you please answer that question.
If you want to go ahead with that, yes, definitely.
Your voice is breaking.
There one question popped up from.
Yes, please, ma'am. Please answer the question.
Okay. Yes, this subject is going to help you out in that aspect. Go ahead with ICJ and this where there okay. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you very much on the organizers for giving me the opportunity to interact with you.
Thank you, Dr. Preeti. Now I call Dr. Alok Sharma for giving insight about white collar crime. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Anju. Namaskar to all. A very warm welcome for the orientation webinar. First of all, I would like to thank our professor in charge, Dr. Sarabjit Kaur, for getting done this orientation webinar. Secondly, I welcome all my dear students to the third semester. And thirdly, I want to tell you that this paper for which I am presenting today, this paper is conceived and prepared by me way back in 2015 with the assistance of other teachers from all the three centers. And at that time, this paper was known as the socio-economic offenses. But gradually, by the orders of the Bar Council, we have to change the nomenclature of this paper. And now it is white collar crimes. Generally, you see law of crimes 3. So it is basically related to the criminal law, but it is not as, IPC, which we talk about. And there is a difference that I will come later on. So earlier it was when we talk about socio-economic offenses. In that situation, we have covered those cases, those acts which were related with the offenses committed in the social aspect, which were having the impact on the economy. So that is why we use the term socio-economic offenses, means the offenses simultaneously affecting the society as well as the economy of any country. At that time, we used to have the Prohibition of Domestic Violence Act against women, and we had SC/ST Atrocities Prevention Act and many others, because those acts were having more impact on social aspect than on economic aspect. But definitely they were also having the economic aspect if you read them in detail. Now, after this, when we have changed the nomenclature, the white collar crimes, in this aspect, we have those laws, those statutes, which are directly dealing with primarily with the economy of the country and secondarily on the social aspect of the country. Now, before I come to the course content and what it has in it, I would like to mention that this paper is preferably for those students who have developed a liking in criminal law in their first year. So if you are attracted by IPC, CRPC, and you try to opt, this paper and also other criminal law related papers, as you are interested that, okay, you can pursue your career in criminal law practice or any other fields related to criminal law, then this course is very much important for you. Now, I would like to say that this paper is very different from whatever you have studied in the first year. Because in the first year, you have come across with Indian Penal Code, that is the substantive law, and the Code of Criminal Procedure, that is the procedural law. So that is about, generally we call it as the traditional criminality. So in traditional criminality, what is the meaning? That it is the IPC, means old crimes were defined and their punishments were given in the IPC. And to implement the substantive law, you have the CRPC, which prescribes how the IPC can be implemented. So those offenses were conceived earlier times. As you know, IPC has been drafted in 1830s itself. So IPC is dealing with those offenses which are there since time immemorial, which we call as criminal offenses. But with the development of time, you see the new kind of criminality emerge, and that kind of criminality cannot be governed by Indian Penal Code because it was insufficient for that kind of criminality, and generally we call that criminality as new criminality. So for new criminality, we require new type of statutes. That is why we have many new statutes addressing the problem of the new criminality. Like earlier in the IPC, when we talk about it, it emphasized why crime has happened. It has happened due to aggression, due to lust, due to pressure, due to anger, and many more reasons. Now, when we shift our focus on the new criminality, the basic cause or the root cause of this criminality is greed of any person for money. So root cause is also different for the new criminality. Now, there are many differences when you see about traditional criminality and the new socioeconomic criminality. It is completely different. And that is why we have different laws to address this. Now, in this course, we have compiled 5 statutes. So this course is different in this very perspective, that it does not talk about any single law or any one statute like you have discussed in the IPC. Here we have 5 different statutes which we generally call as white collar crimes. Now, white collar crimes, why this name? This name is very interesting. As you see, the name is because generally the presumption in society is that crime has been committed by poor people. Poor people commit crime and rich people never commit crime. So in this criminality, when you see these crimes have been committed primarily by the rich people, primarily by the people who are placed in the higher state of society, having a lot of money, and they want to earn more and more money. That is why what we call as white collar crime, because white collar can be worn only by people who are sitting in the cars, who are sitting in their offices, AC offices, and with all luxury and comfort. That is why this term white collar crime has been coined. So basically, in this paper, in this course, we will discuss different kind of crimes committed by rich people, high public servants, and different interesting areas have been discussed. Now I want to come to the course content of the this course. There are 6 topics in all. In the first topic, we discuss what is socioeconomic offenses, what are white collar crimes, why this name is given, what are the theories behind this kind of new criminality, what is the difference between traditional criminality and the this socioeconomic offenses, and what are the consequences, what are the law commission reports and other kind of commission reports which are important for you to understand the basis of this criminality. So basically, topic 1 will be a theoretical topic in order to develop your understanding, the clarity about this subject. Topic 2nd is the first statute, which we take as prevention of immoral trafficking. As the name itself shows, that it is about the trafficking in person, primarily about the prostitutes. Now, this law impacts the society as well as the economy of the country. And interesting aspect of this course is that it does not have full acts. So like in IPC, you have seen that we have discussed few provisions. So similarly, in all these acts, we have selected few provisions for you, which are basic provisions, which are the foundation provisions, which are very important provisions for you to understand. Because in law courses, purpose is not to cover the whole act. The purpose is that you understand how to interpret the law. So we have emphasized only on those provisions. In this topic, many Supreme Court judgments have been prescribed for you for the guidelines issued by Supreme Court, that how to tackle this problem, what are the duties of the government, and how this problem can be prohibited. So it will cover all these aspects. Then we come to the topic 3rd. It is about the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substance Act. As you see, in the last few months, in the last years, we have seen that many cases have emerged regarding the narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances, and this is very, very stringent criminal law. And in this, you see that if you are interested in practicing in this area, it is a very prosperous area for you to practice. So if you have kind of inclination towards the criminal law, if you are interested in these kind of cases, you will discuss about what are these terms are, what are the punishments, and then you get to know that how difficult to get the bail and how stringent punishments are there even for keeping small quantity of prohibited drugs. So this is very, very interesting. Many Supreme Court landmark judgments have been prescribed for you in the course content. Another act which we have taken is the Food Safety and Standards Act. As we all are aware that food is something which we all consume irrespective of our status. If the food is not proper, if the food is not hygienic, if the food is not nutritious and a kind of adulteration is there in the food, it will directly affect our health and ultimately the economy. That is why this act is enacted by the parliament. It is comprehensive act which talks about not only the offenses but also talks about the the authorities which are there to deal in this area, and the foreign things also, and what are the punishment and etc. So in detail they talk about the wholesome thing about the food safety and standards. Another act which we have in our course is the Prevention of Corruption Act. Now you have seen that for the last years we have seen many cases which we come across regarding the corruption of the public servant, about the politicians, about the officials, and those scams you see are crores and crores of rupees affecting the economy directly. Now in this act we have selected certain provisions for you, and we emphasize that the investigation is done only by the CBI in these kind of cases. Then we have mentioned what is the relevance of sanction. If sanction is not taken, then the case will be rejected by the court. So certain step-by-step formalities should be required by the CBI to initiate the proceedings against the public servant. It also tells what are the immunities and protection provided to the public servants. And the last act in this course is the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. Now you see all the acts are very, very important and relevant. As we see, whatever offense we come across in newspaper or any news channel, you see generally we talk about the Enforcement Directorate. We hear that Enforcement Directorate issues notice to such and such person regarding the money. So money laundering is the current very, very important topic, where the people who earn money by corruption or by NDPS transactions or by trafficking, whatever, they have to launder their money in order to show that we are earning the white money and this money is not tainted, etc. So different kind of mechanisms have been used by the accused. So in order to protect the economy, in order to punish those people, the act is there and comprehensive machinery is provided. Now, one other thing which is very important for this is that these are all special criminal laws. So IPC is the traditional criminal law, and these laws are the special criminal laws. Special criminal laws means that they not only define the offenses, what are the offenses, what is the punishment, but they also define the procedure for the same, that who will be the authority, who will investigate, how the investigation will be done, what kind of punishment, different kind of punishments have been mentioned, sentencing policy is different, and the courts are different, special courts are there, special prosecutors are there. So everything is special. Of course, where the special law is silent, then we have to apply the Code of Criminal Procedure because it is the general law. So in all, I must say that this paper is very interesting, and those who have interest in criminal law, they can opt this paper and they will enjoy this paper. Thank you so much. Now I would like to invite any questions and clarification on the subject. Anjuji, please, you can ask the questions, if any.
Yes, please. If anyone is having any doubt, please ask your questions, or you can even write in. Yes, I think there is a no. There is a question in chat box. No, but it's earlier. Please, anyone?
I have tried my best to clarify the course content as well as the scope of the paper.
So, ma'am, yes, one question is there in the chat box that Vaibhav is asking that the scope of this subject is only in corporate sector.
Yes, maybe because corporates are also dealing with money laundering, etc., but not primarily with the corporate, because this course is about the criminal law, and generally you see when we talk about the criminal responsibility, corporations are one of the aspect of that. So maybe if any of the offenses committed by the corporation, then only that can come under the purview. Otherwise, it is a general law and it will be applicable to all areas, I must say.
I believe there is one more question. I think it's from Srijan Singh.
Yes.
She wants to know that if one intends to pursue a master's in law and PhD from an international university, would it help to take this subject?
You see, some of the laws, like I'm talking about narcotic drugs and psychotropic substance and prevention of money laundering. especially in Food Safety and Standards Act. These three acts, and also why not the prevention of immoral trafficking, all these statutes are enacted by our country due to the international pressure only. Due to the international convention and treaties, the government, the parliament was under a pressure to enact the laws. All these statutes are having the international aspects, because when you read this paper, the all the statutes are based on the international conventions and treaty, which imposes the obligation on the state to enact these laws. So definitely I say that even if you go to foreign countries for your further studies, these laws will be helpful for you. Yes. Any other question and clarification, please? If no question and clarification, now I would like to thank the directors of the program, Dr. Anju Sinha and Ms. Shivika Chaudhary, for organizing this program, and thank you for giving me the opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for giving insight about the subjects. Thank you so much for explaining the concept of new criminality and referring to the new laws which have been developed and the laws to deal with the concept of new criminality. So I hope that definitely the students, they are going to be benefited by the details which have been given by you. And even after this webinar, if anyone is having any doubt, he can contact you for the purpose of clarification of doubts.
All students are welcome for any contact, any clarification, any guidance. Thank you so much, and all the best to all of you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now I call upon Dr. Amit Sinha for the purpose of sharing his views on media and law and explaining the subject. Over to you, Amit.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Respected colleagues, dear students. So a very good evening to all of you first. We are here to discuss, the introduction of the subject media law and censorship. Censorship itself comes under the broad ambit of law and regulations. So for our own convenience, we would call it media law. I don't have to explain to you that what important role media plays in a particular society. We all know that media has different sort of roles or play different roles in different country. So in a country where dictatorship is there, obviously the role of media will only to disseminate information which the government sources are telling that media house to the people. Now, the role of media changes dramatically when you talk about any democratic country like ours. In our country, which is a democratic one, the role of media is not only the dissemination of information, the role of media also includes uh, performing a checks and balance on the government organizations, government organs, public officials, public bodies, as well as to some extent certain individuals who are uh, uh, known in this country, like politicians, actors, sportsperson, etc. So it is very important that we have free, objective, and skilled media in a particular democratic country, in a particular democratic society, and this particular free skilled media becomes the sine qua non, which cannot be separated from uh, the constitutional machinery of any country, particularly democratic one. Apart from that, if we since it is the land of Gandhi, let me give you a very brief philosophy of Gandhi on journalism. According to Gandhi, he always believed that the importance of journalism of the media is to serve people, right? The basic or the most important purpose of media is to serve the public interest. Now, in such situation, he also cautioned while writing his autobiography that media has to be in check, like Floods, sometimes what happens, they destroy the countryside, they destroy the crops. Similarly, an uncontrolled pen can also destroy the basic fabric of our society. Therefore, while it is the duty of media to serve people, we also need to have some mechanism to regulate media, whether it is print media, whether it is broadcasting media, or the social media. Uh, Unlike U.S. Constitution's First Amendment, which categorically provides for freedom of press as a right in the U.S. Constitution, do, India do not have uh, any specific provision on freedom of press or media in Indian Constitution. But time and again, courts have very categorically clarified that freedom of media, freedom of press, which comes falls under freedom of speech and expression, is an integral part of Article 19(1)(a) of Indian Constitution. So from Bennett Coleman versus Union of India, Ramesh Thapar versus State of Madras, uh, uh, then Shreya Shingal versus Union of India, all these cases which are there are numerous. Indian Express versus Union of India, there are plethora of cases. All these cases have maintained that media is a very integral part of constitutional machinery. It acts as the fourth pillar. It creates a checks and balance within the different organs of the organization of the government as well as on the private body. So as overall, the role of media is very important in our society. Uh, Having said the brief, giving you the brief introduction with respect to the role of a media in a society, now we shall move to the laws and regulations part, because ultimately we are going to study media and law. We're not studying media itself. We are not going to deal with media or the subject of media separately from law. We are actually overlapping the media in social sciences with basically tells you the history of legislative efforts. So what are the history of legislative efforts? What does it mean? So it will have mostly three parts. The first part would deal with what was the position of media when we were colonized. Means when Britishers were here and when Britishers were ruling us. So Vernacular Press Act, Freedom of Press Act, all these different types of acts will have to go through very, very briefly. And then what role media or Indian medias, both in English language and vernacular languages, played to get us freedom, or what was their role in freedom struggle. And the third and the last part, which we shall study in legislative effort, would be what efforts are made after the independence of the country, what laws which are there in place, how we have improved upon different laws from 1947 to present, to till this date. Then we shall move on to the second module. Second module of your syllabus is very important one. Why this is important? Because it has at least five very important elements. First element is definitely relating to the Constitution. It will we shall discuss here Article 19(1), 19(1)(a), and some limitation which can be there on media, right, which are provided under Article 19 Clause 2, right? So all these elements relating to Constitution and relating to media, freedom of press, freedom of media, those cases which deal with such issues will be discussed here. The next element which we shall discuss would be privacy, defamation, and sting operations. What happens when a particular media house writes something about a particular man and he does not like it and he treats it as a defamation, right? Let's say, for example, a sexual harassment case is put up against a judge, or now a particular article writes this particular piece in a particular media house, maybe let's say Indian Express, right? And that judge who is serving judge does not like it, that you're talking about sexual harassment against me. What would be the example of this such scenario? The, I mean, let's go to Supreme Court. We find many examples from Satyendra Kumar to Ganguli to Gogoi. So these cases may not be true, but it can still damage the reputation of an individual who is holding a public office. Now, what are the restraint, or what are the regulations or the laws which are there in place which discourages media to write such articles which may hamper a person's, or which may destroy a person's reputation? Then another important element is a sting operation. Can there be any sting operation? Is it allowed? Can media houses do sting operations? So what would be the laws regarding that? So we will again have to depend upon the case laws. So there's a case, RK Anand case, which says if a sting operation done in public interest, it is fine. Then there's Rajat Saxena's case versus CBI. That case, when government officials are doing sting operations, it is not allowed. However, when it is done by public individuals, then we have to see whether this particular sting operation was done in public interest or not. And it depends upon the facts and circumstances of each case. Then there are other elements like right to information and trial by media. You know that trial by media is a very important aspect which we have to understand. Uh, and the best part of studying this subject is you will have so many examples that you can relate it to each and element of your syllabus. So when we talk about trial media, you will remember that there was a news channels we were discussing the WhatsApp messages of some actresses, especially when the investigating agencies were actually doing the investigation. So not only that, there have been like Jessica Lange murder case, there have been instances where the matter is sub judice, it means pending before the court, and media is through different articles, through broadcasting media, is creating a public perception where even the judge would come under pressure, because judges are also public individuals. They can also succumb to pressure, public perception. So when such things are done, media trial assumes a negative connotation. Media trial basically in any way considered as a negative connotation, has negative connotation. When such thing happens, then it creates obstruction in the administration of justice, which is basically delivered by judges in our courts. So it is not considered good. Then the third module, which is you will be studying, is contempt of court. You know there are two types of civil and contempt, civil and criminal contempt. Supreme Court has been very lenient with respect to when it comes to contempt cases. A mere sorry and apology has been accepted by the courts to a large extent in 95% cases. Although there have been cases where some imprisonment has also been given, but again, those imprisonment cases, sentences have been revoked after the individuals have apologized to the court. Then the fourth module, again very important, deals with the regulation of different media. So what different types of regulators are there to regulate our bodies? So as we discussed, there are three main different forms of media. First is print media, second is broadcasting media, third is social media. So what are the bodies which can regulate print media? So the first name which comes to, in fact, the main name which comes to mind is Press Council Act. Press Council Act basically regulates the print media in general, right? With respect to broadcasting media is regulated by plethora. I mean, there are various complex web of bodies which actually regulate broadcasting media. So from Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, to TRAI, which is Telecommunication Regulatory Authority of India, to some independent regulatory bodies as well. And when it comes to social media, there we have IT Act, but in Sriya Shingal's case, Section 66A of IT Act was held ultra vires of the Constitution. So, though IT Act is there, but 66A is not the relevant section because it has been annulled. Some other sections like 6, 8, 9 are there, which regulate social media. And then the fifth, again, which talks about advertisements, media, etc. So the first element is commercial speech. Can there be commercial speech? Does commercial speech comes under Article 19(1)(a)? The court have held in Hamdard Dawakhana versus MTNL, sorry, Tata Press Limited, that uh, commercial speeches can come within the ambit of Article 19(1)(a). Similarly, government advertisements. So if government is advertising on its policies, government is advertising on its achievements. Can it do so? Can it use the taxpayers' money? So all these elements, whether the government can, or the questions whether the government can use the taxpayers' money to put a poster saying that this is what we have achieved, is it valid or not? Third, sixth module, very important module, it talks about censorship. So in India, pre-censorship is not allowed. So what is the meaning of post prior restraint or pre-censorship? Pre-censorship is that that something is going to be published, it will going to be a defamation case against a particular individual, but still you cannot pose a restraint on the media houses. Why you cannot pose a restraint on media houses? Because Indian constitution does not recognize anything which is prior restraint until unless it is published. After the matter is published, then you can put a prohibition for its on its circulation if it is defamatory, if it is found to be defamatory. Then in that situation, post censorship is allowed, prior censorship is not allowed in India. Seventh module basically deals with the reporting of the parliamentary proceedings. Article 105, 194, and 361A of Indian Constitution deals with such matter that usually participation, anything which is happening in parliament can be reported unless it is not done with the malice or bad intention or malafide intentions. Last module is media and contemporary issues. It deals with poll surveys, it deals with paid news. You would know that paid news is not allowed. There was a case relating to this, that some media houses were paid to broadcast some news. Similarly, poll surveys, the uh, uh, only post poll surveys are allowed in India. Pre poll surveys are not allowed. So when the election has come to an end, media houses and different individuals can go to surveys and do the surveys. So this is the overall understanding of our subjects with respect to which we shall be studying in this subject, in this particular part. This is not a very technical subject, it's a very simple subject, and most of it is related to Constitution of India. So you would be almost very comfortable because you will be studying Constitution also. So it is one of the most fascinating subjects you will read or studying in optional courses. Why? Because you will be able to relate to the examples which are happening in our society. There have been distinction in today's time that there's something is left media, something is Godi media. So but our purpose is not to say that something is Godi media or something is left media. Our purpose here to understand what laws are there, and if to critically analyze those laws, if those laws are relevant or not, if those laws are too strong that it suffocates media or the freedom of media. We know that in freedom of uh, press ranking, our country does not do very well. So we will have to analyze these laws and regulations critically as well, and we will also try to undertake some comparative study as well in this particular module. Okay, thank you so much. If you have any questions, that would be wonderful. हाँ दीप्ति बताओ.
Sir, these all were academic part of the subject. What about the career aspects and the thing which we can pursue the subject for? Like, what are the scope for the subject?
Because as I told you, this subject is most of the subject, most of the content of the subject would be related to Constitution of India. So whether if you're applying for judiciary, whether you're going for civil services or you're going for practice, you would find the relevance of law in all the spheres of the competitive examinations, because freedom of press has so many landmark judgments, also laws, and plus Constitution is anyway there, that you will find these questions uh, almost every year in each of these competitive examinations. So yes, from a career perspective, whether you're going for judiciary, civil services, litigation, in all these sectors, this particular law would definitely play its role because it's mostly related to Constitution. Whether you're going for LLM examination, you will have some constitutional law questions, which may or may not relate to Article 19, right? So it is definitely going to help you. Plus, it's an optional course. It gives you more nuanced understanding of a subject, which may not be able to cover in constitutional law subject. Okay, anyone else?
Sir, also, if we don't take the subject, then what all we miss on the part of career aspect?
No, you're not going to miss anything. You will be studying all the relevant subject. Any subject you're going to take is going to benefit you in some way or other. Especially in LLB course, you are not here to gain expertise in a particular subject. You will be you're basically jack of all the subjects. The master you will become only after doing the master of laws. So any subjects you're taking, all the subjects are going to help you. Even if you're not leaving, even if you're leaving one subject, it's not going to harm you substantially. It's not going to hamper your interest in any manner. Anyone else?
Thank you, sir.
All right, if there are no questions, thank you so much, Anju ma'am and Shivika and all the students who were there. And we would like to see for more opportunities like this to interact with the students and definitely with all our respected colleagues. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Amit, for sharing your views on the subject and discussing the relevance and the scope of the subjects. I'm sure that the students, they are definitely going to be benefited from your discussion, because on the one hand, you discuss the relevance of media, you discuss the relevance of fundamental right under 191A. On the other hand, you have discussed the requirement to regulate that fundamental right, because no fundamental right is absolute. So I think definitely your presentation is going to help the students to reach to a decision that whether to opt this subject or not. So thank you so very much.
No problem. Okay. Welcome, ma'am.
So now I propose vote of thanks, and I take this opportunity to thank our professor in charge, Professor Dr. Sarabjit Kaur, for her constant support and guidance in organizing this webinar for overview of optional subjects. I express my sincere gratitude to all the resource persons for taking out time from their busy schedule on such a short notice and sharing their expertise on their respective subjects. I'm really grateful to Dr. Alok Sharma for giving insight of white-collar crime, Dr. Preeti Rana for explaining the scope of private international law, Dr. Amit Sinha for sharing his views on relevance and importance of media and law subject. I'm really grateful to all of you to explain the subjects and syllabus, which I believe is really going to help the students to take a rational decision and choose a right optional subject for them. So students are really going to be immensely benefited by your views on respective subjects. So I'm really thankful to all of you. I'm also thankful to Shivika Chaudhary, the program co-director, for her efforts and all technical assistance towards making this program a success. And a big thanks to all of you, all the students who are attending this program, and for making this program a huge success. Before concluding, again, I'm repeating few points which I mentioned earlier. Number one, option form, subject option form will be available from 7 p.m. today itself. But as I mentioned earlier, don't fill option form in a hurry. Think twice and take a reasoned decision on the basis of information given by the resource persons. Secondly, Filling of option form is mandatory for all. So please fill option form within the deadline, that is before the time which is being given. I think it's Monday by 5 p.m. Next, even after webinar, if you have any doubt or query, you can contact the resource person for that. And once your option form is filled, then it is final. After that, you are not allowed to change it. That's why I mentioned that think twice, then you fill your option form. Because once you have filled this, then you are not allowed to change it. And one more thing, please inform your friends who could not attend today's webinar due to any reasons that this program will be uploaded on the official website of YouTube channel of Law Center 1. So they can watch the program there also. So I think there is some query. Someone has raised hand. Yes, Shivani? Shivmani. Yes, sorry. It's Shivmani Upadhyay.
Oh, good evening, ma'am. No, ma'am. It was my mistake. My
Okay, Okay. So thank you so much to all of you. And as I mentioned, again, I am repeating that the program will be uploaded on YouTube. So those of you who have missed the program, your friends, you can just inform them. Thank you so much.